Welcome to the Pier 150 webinar series. I am Mike Kaiser, co-founder of the Pier 150, and today I'm joined by Barbara Banks-Pryor, CHRO at Cook County Health, Chris Rogers, a partner at Mercer, Eric Hunn, the CHRO at BellRing Brands, and Ami Parekh, the head of HR at Uber Eats. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our partner in the webinar series, First Tech Credit Union. They not only sponsor this webinar series, but also our in-person events. Thank you very much once again for supporting this initiative. Before we get started, just a note on, before we get to that, I wanted to let you all know that on our website, we now have the webinar series online, so you can look at the upcoming events as well as past events, and you can download the the recorded broadcast from there if you're interested. Just go to pier150.com 2020 webinar series. Before we get started, I also like to talk about the Zoom platform. There's a Q&A section there that you can use to ask questions of the panel. If you see a question on there that you would like answered, you can upvote that. Those will rise to the top, and I will monitor that queue and ask those questions as appropriate. So let's get started. Thank you all again for joining us today, and I'd like to just run through and have you do a quick introduction of your current role and organization. So Eric, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks Mike for having us. Good morning, Eric Hunn. I'm head of HR for BellRing Brands, probably not a brand you're familiar with. We did an IPO back in the fall, a very different world back then. A lot of excitement around that, but we sell Power Bar is our brand, and then also Premier Protein Shakes. So one of the largest players in kind of that food and nutrition and protein industry. So very popular products at this time, and excited to be here. I've been in HR for about 10 years. Prior to BellRing, I was with Whole Foods, and obviously in a very different world now than when I was on the retail front lines. But as I was chatting with Mike before we came live, I was reminded that I have a bit of an unusual background in HR, in that I started my career in the federal government and was actually with the Office of Management and Budget, part of the White House. So about 15 years ago, we were actually spending a ton of time working and trying to figure out how to do pandemic flu planning. And so I spent about 5 years thinking about these kinds of things as part of the federal government, and was on the task force that has now evolved to be the coronavirus task force. But that background has been helpful just in kind of informing some of the science behind this and how we manage these issues. So delighted to be here.
Thank you, Eric. Chris.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Thanks, Mike. Chris Rogers. I am a senior consultant with the Health and Benefits practice with Mercer out of the West Coast. Been with the firm combined total of about 6 years. So this is my second round. I actually was with Mercer for a bit of time right after college. And then I actually took a little bit of a detour outside of human capital and HR, and actually left and got my MBA, and then spent the next 4 years working for brand marketing and innovation for Taco Bell and for Nestle. So I'm very familiar with Power Bar. But I really wanted to get back into healthcare. I think there's a lot of opportunity to create significant change and drive real meaningful outcomes for patients and for employees and employers. And so I bounced back into the consulting world, was with Aon for about 8 years, and the most recent 3 was running the Southern California practice for Aon. Was this general curiosity about how life was like on both the supply and the demand. And with my entire career on the demand side of the equation, I wanted to see what life was like on the supply side. So I went to go work for a large national player, went to work for Anthem for about 1.5 years, working in strategy and account management. But at the end of the day, my passion lies around the intersection of health and productivity as it relates to a digital ecosystem, and how we can push and drive ourselves to think and do things a little bit differently. And so that's when I decided to bounce back into the consulting world. And I've been with Mercer going on, like I said, to combine about 6 years. Thrilled to be here, thrilled for the conversation today, and really looking forward to the panel. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Chris. Barbara.
Hi, good morning. My name is Barbara Pryor. I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer here at Cook County Health. It's the second largest public health system in the country. We have been around for about 180 years. And, we are also a safety net hospital. So as you can see, I'm sitting in my office today. I have been here for about 6 years. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time doing consulting. I worked for Price Waterhouse, Deloitte, IBM, doing technology consulting. So mostly implementing HR systems. And so I say my expertise is connecting the dots between technology and human capital, right? What can we do to make things a lot more efficient, effective, and increase our brand within an organization? And so excited to be here today. Looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Barbara. Ame.
Hi, my name's Ami Parekh. I work for Uber Technologies, and I lead HR for the Uber Eats function, the US division. This is our food delivery business, and it's about $8 billion in gross bookings. So really, exciting journey here. Prior to Uber, I worked for Expedia Group for a long time. And before that, similar to Barbara, I was actually with IBM in the HR function. So being over a decade in technology, and today I'm very excited to be here and share some practices with the team.
Thank you. So to get started with the discussion, does the workplace need a place? Great question. A lot of forward-thinking statements are going to be made today, right? And none of us really know. I think things change every week, but I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion about, getting your guys' thoughts around, what you're looking at, what you think is going to be some of the challenges, some of the maybe opportunities along the way. So, Eric, I kind of want to start with you. Obviously with the working environment going virtual for most people, almost entirely virtual for many, what are some of the things that you're currently addressing, and maybe some of the challenges, and maybe kind of a few of the opportunities that you're looking at right now?
Yeah, we, for those of you who are on the call who are thinking about just sort of the office-based environment, I think my perspective has really changed in the last 2 or 3 weeks about what that looks like in sort of the shorter term. And so I think a lot of us were thinking about, how do we safely get people back in the office? And there was lots of people saying do staggered desks and plexiglass shields. And I think that was sort of a risk mitigation idea with the default presumption that you actually have to go back into the office immediately. And so how do we make it safer? And there certainly are some people who are doing critical functions that just physically have to be in the office. But, we're one of those brands that actually has the luxury, with very few exceptions, of being, essentially knowledge workers who are working surprisingly well on the digital platform, better than we were hoping for. And so our perspective has really shifted, at least, until there's some widespread sense of, a vaccine or a therapeutic that makes people feel like the risk has gone way, way down, is, if I put everybody behind shields, if I put barriers up, what's the point of having my folks in the office? There really isn't any, other than, kind of thinking about giving them some more, elbow room or comfort in the way that at one point you might have thought about a WeWork of like, hey, I just need a comfortable office to work. And of course, the idea of those kinds of flexible spaces like a WeWork was actually because you wanted to have this fun, kind of casual, free-flowing thing. And that's really the opposite of what all the science is telling us is going to be helpful right now. And so, the big concern, and I think the emerging science is really around, the more we're speaking, the more we're sort of sharing the same airspace, the higher the risk is. And so what my folks really need to do, if they absolutely have to go in the office and we feel like it's safe, is, okay, I'm going into the office with the presumption that I'm going to have actually super minimal interactions with people. And so what is the value of that overall if I'm just going into an office to sort of cower in the corner away from people? And if what we're missing, and we are to some degree, is collaboration, let's not pretend like going into the office is going to all of a sudden open up a world of collaboration. The collaboration is going to have to actually happen virtually, at least for the time being. And so if I'm sitting in my office or the corner or a conference room in the office with the door closed, getting on my Zoom meeting, what's the point of being in the office if I'm exposing myself to risk? And so that's kind of the emergent thinking of don't try to bury your way into a collaboration. The collaboration needs to be morphing into the online world.
Yeah, and Barbara, I wanted to jump to you. Eric brings up a good point of, what does that office environment look like? And you're on the front lines, you're in your office right now, right? So you've been dealing with this for a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about kind of your environment and what you're seeing as far as, you know, the virtual aspect of your organization as well as the in-office experience.
Right. Yeah. Well, let me say this, that we're a hospital, right? We have 3 hospitals, 14 clinics. And so, and about, 6,200 employees spread across those locations. And so if you think about from a healthcare perspective, we are essential workers. And so we have probably 65 to 70% of our staff are required to be in to care for patients. And so when we look at that, we say, which ones, based on the client volume, how do we rotate our employees in and out? So we may rotate them in, nurses may rotate, doctors, our clinical staff will rotate in based on the clinical volumes. And then our non-clinical staff, for the most part, we have moved towards telework. So if you can imagine, we're not just healthcare, we're also government. And telework is not a concept that has been, well, at the federal government level, but not here in Illinois on the local county level, has telework been something that has been very well received. And so this really forced us into that paradigm. We had a telework policy, but prior to the pandemic, if we had 6 people who teleworked, that was a lot, right? Now we probably have upwards of over 1,000 people who are teleworking. So it really has pushed us into a separate space that we're probably not as comfortable with. And it's really forcing us to say, hey, what do we need to do to make sure that our managers understand what telework really is? How do we make sure that they understand also how to manage and work with a remote workforce, right? How do we measure people based on outcomes and results, and not just because they sat at their desk for 8 hours and so we know they were working and we could see them, right? It's a different type of mentality. And so we're doing a lot of different things to bring training, to work with technology tools so we can help to, make sure our employees have the appropriate tools to work effectively from home. So it definitely has taken us out of our comfort zone completely and into a new paradigm. But I think this is what it is today, right? So I'm in my office right now. When I come in the building, I wear a surgical mask. We rotate people in and out of HR. We don't have our full staff on site. We have typically about 60 people who work in HR. Today, we have 3 to 4 people in the office, just enough so that we can manage any people who come to our doors who have questions. And then everything else is done electronically. We put in a case management system last year, which has really helped us and saved us here, because everything our employees need from us or desire or questions, et cetera, are all online in a case management tool. So we can pretty much address most of their questions, probably 95% of their questions, without having any face-to-face contact.
Thank you, Barbara. And Ami, I wanted to, at Uber Eats, you've had folks like drivers that were always remote and a lot of office staff. Can you talk a little bit about the transition there and kind of what you're looking at as far as challenges going forward?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for asking. So you're absolutely right. In the past, we had many jobs that we had deemed in-office jobs, including a lot of our sales employees, even our call center employees. This has pushed the envelope, and we're almost 90+% remote at this time. Moving forward, we do have certain roles that we still consider in office, and they are called what we call as green light hubs. So whenever you want to sign up with Uber as a driver or a courier, we do certain tests and we want on your vehicle, and we want to make sure you follow our standards and provide the right amount of service and comfort for our customers. So those jobs have been physical, and I think moving forward we'll have to find a way for that to come back. Right now it's largely driven by the government regulations and lockdowns in various countries across the world, and we're being compliant with that. So in some countries this is completely shut down, and in some countries we're operating in a very, very limited capacity for some of these. But yes, it's definitely shifted a lot of our thinking to the remote work environment. The other thing I'll say is one of the reasons we do at some point want to open up our offices, at least in limited capacity, even if it's maybe 40%, is we have a lot of people just in the US who are in San Francisco and New York City. And just by the very definition of their locations and where they are, they are in, you know, relatively smaller apartments with families and kids, and it's just not practical to expect them to have an entire, you know, room to themselves, which is cordoned off and just focusing on meetings. So eventually, you know, at least, you know, for some of our employees, we do want to, you know, have a space where they can come back in and you know, be more effective and more productive. I think this is still in the early stages. We haven't opened up our offices yet, but I think in the coming few months, depending on which, you know, countries are allowing us, we will go to a point where we're doing temperature checks, we're opening up in very limited capacities, only certain roles, etc. So those are discussions that are still underway, but in the next few weeks, we'll build up, you know, more of our policies around that.
So Chris, I wanted to go to you. You know, 3 different companies, 3 different dynamics as far as working virtually, office, you know, different challenges. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing? And, you know, I think our audience out there, probably every one of them has a little bit different situation. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective? It's kind of that global view of what's going on. Is what are some of the things that HR executives should be looking at as far as a virtual work environment, maybe some of the challenges they're going to run into?
So absolutely. So I think you hit the nail on the head in exactly that. Every individual company has got an individual workforce, individual needs, individual requirements. And I think it's up obviously to detail planning and thinking through the impact of the individual employee. But when we look through, and again, Mike, you teed it off nicely, we're going to be thinking sort of future state and speculation and sort of what's sort of on the next horizon. As we take a step back and look at what's happened in this tragedy over the last couple of months, in my mind, I see sort of 3 things emerging from the push to virtual. Right? So obviously we're seeing the need to collaborate and to innovate and to create teams in an individual environment, which some companies are further along in that ecosystem than others. But we're also seeing a push towards more virtual care, which has been a foundational surge in terms of how individuals are accessing care to be removed from the ecosystem so they don't enter the ecosystem and risk exposure. And that virtual ecosystem is creating some challenges and some concerns for some employers, because as they think through their broader overall care strategy around how they're going to ensure the right care is delivered at the right place in the right time, this virtual ecosystem is something that's been on the back burner that's now very much in front and center. So how does that play into the broader objectives and core healthcare strategy? The second thing that we're really focusing on is the need for not only physical health, but emotional health. And so this surge of isolation and depression, how do we make sure that our clients and their employees and their managers are adequately staffed to pick up on those triggers in a virtual environment? And how are we making sure that they're accessing the right care, they understand where to go? Because this dramatic shift that's occurred over the last couple of months is unprecedented. And we're only just beginning to sort of understand the impacts on the individual because we don't have an end in sight. There is no end game. There's no sort of future end state. So we want to make sure our employers are thinking through not to over rotate on one area of their strategy, but think through how this pandemic will evolve because there will be eventual resolution, we believe. So I want to keep that front in mind. And the third one that I think is tremendously interesting is as we move to virtual, instead of being located in a central hub in like an office space, we're now back in our local communities. And so we're starting to think through how that impacts local resources, the systems, the transportation, the local food delivery. And we talk through the need for more food on demand like Uber Eats. And so that stress on the community is going to be one of grave importance, because with that stress and that change, one of the areas of concern is as we make sure we look through social determinants of health, and the ones that are really high up on the radar, obviously childcare insecurity and food insecurity and transportation, but we're also looking at domestic and child abuse, because with that push to virtual, we really want to help understand the risks associated with that and how we can help our clients identify, support, and create that ecosystem that is based off of the community first. Because as we move back to our homes, that's where we're going to see a lot of opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. And Eric, I want to go back to you because, one of the things Chris brought up was that mental health wellness of employees. And, I think there is an aspect out there of people working virtually and feeling isolated. You brought up a great point that just because you have an office environment, there may be some restrictions based on CDC guidelines or whatever it might be, that you can't create a very collaborative environment. How are you looking at that as far as employees that want to get back to kind of the normal, right, which may never exist? How are you dealing with that, not only in, maybe some things you're doing for employees now, but I think more importantly, how are you looking at the future office environment to create that kind of an environment that a lot of people want? They want to get back to that.
Yeah, I think the challenge is going to be, we've kind of hit on a theme that in the shorter term, really the prioritization needs to be people who need functionality in the office. And so for the rest of the folks, we really have to figure out what are we really missing in terms of those, the texture of interactions that we used to have in the office, and how do you do the best to replicate it? And so, I'm kind of in the school of, let's not swing too far on the pendulum one way or the other and pretend like we haven't missed something, because, one of the things that I've noticed is, there's this research that shows that we all like to pretend like we live in one society, but people actually travel on the same channels. They go to different grocery stores than other people. They go to different, kinds of forums and restaurants. And I think the same thing is happening a little bit in the office, is that there's these channels, and, there's this old phrase of like, everywhere you go, there you are. But what you're missing is there's probably a ton of people on your team who maybe never see your face, have no chance to like pull you aside on the hallway and have those brief interactions in this world. And so what are the ways that we can find, to sort of replicate all those kind of quick, you want to make the barriers to entry really kind of low in that regard, so that you can, allow people to ask you questions and not feel like it's going to be something where I need to carve out 30 minutes on your, calendar in order to get a little bit of advice. And so I think, some of the things we're thinking about are, how do we do, not so much the happy hours just for the socialization, because I'm a little bit leery of those, because everybody thinks that that's the best way to kind of connect. And I think for most of us, we've evolved to, gosh, this Zoom thing is really more draining than we would have expected. The last thing I want to be doing is pretending to socialize, with these folks. And I'm getting enough pressure in my personal life to socialize with, my loved ones that maybe are remote and things like that. And so, like, how do you have a 10-minute quick conversation with somebody who's a leadership team member? Can you make yourself available to office hours that say, Eric is sitting there live on this empty Zoom meeting, and you can pop on or not as you need. All I know is that he's going to keep, 20 minutes on his calendar every Tuesday, and you can, hop on a call, and there might be 5 other people, there might be nobody. He might be sitting there tapping away on his keyboard, answering emails, but he's there. So if you have that silly, stupid, question that you feel like, I don't want to bother this guy with, there's a forum to do that. So those kinds of things in terms of, just the quick interactions that we're trying to simulate as best we can, and not pretend like we're not losing something, because, people have seen me, because we have all company meetings every Monday to kind of set the stage. My team sees me. But other than that, there's probably 90% of the company that has not had a, communication back with me. I'm communicating out to them, but they're not communicating back.
Thanks, Eric. And Barbara, interested in kind of what you're seeing in an environment where you do have a lot of folks on site, but you are on shift. So maybe some, people that normally would interact aren't getting that interaction. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you're doing and what you're seeing at Cook County?
Yeah, I think we're still trying to figure a lot of it out. One of the things we've been doing a lot, and I understand what Eric said about the, we have social hours every Friday, where, I think for the most part, initially, it was just good to be able, for the team to be able to see each other. So we really didn't talk about business. We tried to share positive stories, accomplishments, things of that nature. And we even attempted to play a few virtual games, right? So I think that gave staff, at least in the short term, an opportunity. But now we've got to start to pivot towards other ways to communicate. Those folks that are in the office, I mean, for the most part, people try to keep that social distancing. We stress that around the 6 feet and a mask, right? We make sure that if someone does come in your office, you don't have on a mask, that you then put it on. So I still think even when you're in the office, you do have an opportunity, especially on the clinical side of the house, right? The social distancing may not even be something that can be attainable, right? So when you're working with patients, et cetera, the 6 feet and a mask is not something that can be done, but with the proper PPE and equipment, then you certainly can get closer. So I think on the clinical side of the house, because people are are masked and in full PPE in some cases who are treating COVID, that they probably have a lot more interaction. It's more on the administrative and non-clinical side that we're going to really have to start to think differently around how do we start to engage. And our biggest concern is around community engagement, right? So how do we make sure that, you know, I spent probably half of my career in consulting, right? So I'm used to not necessarily having to work in an office, but there are a lot of people that this is their first, you know, opportunity where they have not had that interaction. So how do you keep your employees engaged in what the mission is and engaged in the work and the initiatives that the organization is working towards? And so we've definitely got to give a lot more thought to how do we make sure that that continues to happen.
Thank you, Barbara. And I know that you've done some surveys with your employees about how they're doing, right, and what they're struggling with. Can you share a little bit of those results? Because I think some of them are really interesting about, you know, what people are thinking right now.
Yeah, Mike, so in March, I want to say that's when Uber shut down all offices globally and said, you know, do not come into offices anymore. It's just not safe. And this is for all countries and no exceptions at this time. And a few weeks in, it had gotten us all thinking that, you know, how do we even find out how our employees are doing? Yes, anecdotally, we may find out a little bit here and there, but you know, we're more than 25,000 employees globally. So how do we even find out, you know, how are they doing? So we did a survey specifically on this topic to understand, you know, how are they experiencing this, you know, what's working, what's absolutely not working. What we found, you know, amongst the list of challenges that our employees are facing was the first one was reduced physical activity. They had not expected that along with all this, they just wouldn't be able to go down or run to the gym or do, so, you know, do a lot of the things that all of us had, of course, taken for granted before. The second challenge that we found was there was a huge amount of anxiety regarding health concerns related to COVID. Am I going to be next? Is my older parent going to be next? And you know, does my friend have it anymore? Or I think there was just a lot around, you know, anxiety around that. The third biggest group I think we found was caregivers for children, caregivers for, you know, older parents, and, you know, how do I balance my responsibilities and Zoom calls for my kid along with my own Zoom calls and, you know, whatever this is, you know, that we define as new life. They also significantly missed the social interaction, much to Barbara and Eric's points on, you know, office is a safe haven for many, for so many different reasons, and just not getting that at all, and Zoom being as draining and far more awkward with 10 people on the call. It just wasn't the same. So those were the top 3 or 4 challenges that, you know, we saw amongst our employees. After that, what we did is we did a few strong pushes. We have now asked our people managers globally to be far more flexible with work hours and not expect a classic 9 to 5. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore unless you're literally single and you know, can dedicate all of that time. So what are some other hours that you can expect your employees to work? Maybe evenings, maybe nights, you know, doesn't matter when they get their work done, as long as they get it done. We also are pushing a lot on, you know, meetings, and how many are really essential meetings. Do you all have to get together at 11 a.m. to do something or discuss something? Is that literally the only way you can think of operating? So just, you know, encouraging them to think some more on, you know, what is essential on people's time, you know, what are the hours that you want people to work, and how flexible can you be? And then in addition, we've also partnered with a startup in the Bay Area. It's called Lyra Health, Lyra, and they provide access to our employees to a lot of therapists, and we give them a certain number of free sessions annually. And that's seen a huge uptick as well overall. So I think it's a combination of things, but I think for us, yes, the starting point was definitely, you know, what exactly is happening with our employees and what are the areas where we can help them with.
Thank you, Ami. And Chris, so, you know, when you look at those results, there's, you know, and it may be generational, but it's more the home life situation that I think really reflects the challenges around mental wellness and how people are doing with the pandemic itself, working from home virtually and all that. For maybe the younger generation, maybe they've got some cramped spaces and it's not comfortable. Maybe you've got that, as Ami mentioned, the caregiver, where they've got young children, and there's that aspect they're trying to deal with work. Maybe a little bit older folks have older children that need some support, and then you've got the older generation. Can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges and kind of where you're seeing a lot of the challenge points within each one of those kind of dynamics or groups?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've spent a large chunk of our time pre-COVID thinking about generational differences in the workforce as it relates to Gen Z, Gen Y, millennials, et cetera, and trying to understand how you motivate, engage, and essentially create this efficient organization that is tailored to a multiple different generational group. To your point, Mike, with this push to virtual, I feel, and this might be, and I would love to to hear from the panelists, but I feel like that generational discussion has been turned on its head a little bit, because it's less like around. We still have some of the same issues around millennials and primary care. We still have some of the same issues in terms of accessing care that we see through generational divides. But now with the stress of working from home, there are, like Tommy's point, there are other additional needs that we have to address and to make sure that we're understanding or being empathetic to. And I think part of that challenge is that you'll see this childcare insecurity that we keep talking about. Something as simple as will there be IRS relief on dependent care FSAs? What were you going to do with mid-year elections? I've got to take care of my family. Will summer camps be covered under dependent care flexible spending accounts? So there's those needs that are very specific and real for individuals with small children. There's needs around it, like we talked about with the Zoom calls, being on your own Zoom call versus helping to maintain and facilitate a Zoom call for your kids and their distance learning, coupled with individuals that may not have any children or that are single or working in different locations. And that's why I keep coming back to this need to help managers understand that ecosystem and be more empathetic, and to realize that there's different connection points for different individuals. We talked about the different working hours. We're talking about the different ways to access care and access individual employees specifically. But I really think that this discussion around the generational divide is still very much present. But what I'm really interested to think through and see how this develops is how the older generation that may not have the young kids, will they be able to understand and be empathetic to their coworkers that may not have to be able to maintain a 9-to-5 schedule? And how are we going to help them to create that future collaboration? Because this is now becoming a very real way to connect on a personal level. Don't get me wrong. It's been actually very interesting to see the dynamics change on Zoom calls where people are opening up their personal lives. But that the blend between having individuals understand what somebody's going through and how they can help. We're trying to make sure that we really understand that shift from the generational discussion to, okay, what my home life stress and pressure is me putting on, and how will that impact my productivity, my work hours, and again, collaboration and teamwork. And I would love to hear, obviously, from Eric, Barbara, and Ami about their experiences as well on this. That's something I find very interesting.
Yeah, and Eric, as Chris mentioned, the 9-to-5 challenge is there, right? When you've got that home life, you have to juggle that. You may have some homeschooling you need to do. It's a real issue because people feel like, especially being disconnected a little bit, people have anxiety about their job and productivity and expectations. I know you're dealing a lot with that in your workforce today. Can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges and what you're doing to try to mitigate those as much as possible?
Yeah, I think Chris had a great perspective on it, and it really is about, it's less about the generation you're in, I think, and more about what your home situation is, the degree to which you can focus at certain times of the day based on, what's going on in the background in your world. And so, for some people, the generational thing, you might be on the younger side, but you have kids at home who are, young, or, those things I think are less important. And so I think what we really need to shift to is, where are the roles where you sort of have to have this synchronous communication, and where are the ones where you can have the asynchronous communication? And so, there might be people who really need to have a more defined space where they're collaborating because there's a real-time or a close to real-time exchange of information if you're trying to work through ideas and things like that. And there are other roles where you know, if I go out and you give me some guidance, I'll go off and work for 4 days and come back and do a checkpoint with you and kind of let me do my own thing. And so what we're trying to do is really shift to more of a way of sorting those kinds of roles out and say, you know, what are the people that really need to have a more durable center of their day so that people can find them for those needs? And what are the roles where people can just kind of figure out how to do it whenever they do, you know? And what's, to me, the most interesting thing from a people standpoint or from an HR standpoint is this could really open up our minds to some flexibilities. You know, the reason why I got passionate about this field and kind of moved out of the federal government space was because I really liked the idea of making work this like thing that you figure out how to do in some really interesting ways that are highly freedom centric. And so if I could, you know, tell my team, like, go out and find, you know, whatever works for you. If you are, you know, working at 9 o'clock at night and you're finally freed up from that and you can completely own the fact that, like, hey, I went for a 2-hour hike in the middle of the day on Friday. And yes, I communicated where I was if somebody needed me and said, I'll come find you in 4 hours. Does that work? That is a beautiful world in which, you know, the work world could actually happen. To just say, if you have the right kind of attributes as an employee, we don't really care how it gets done as long as it gets done. And so do I need to care about PTO? Do I need to care about, you know, all of these kinds of things that we're really wedded to in the past, or some sort of, you know, 9 to 5? If you have great ownership of your work, if you're transparent and responsive when needed in a crisis or something urgent, and if you get shit done, you know, that's probably good enough for us in the future for virtually every role. And isn't that the way we all want to work, if we have the luxury of being, you know, somebody that works principally from a computer-based platform?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I do want to get back, I think, to the productivity and, you know, management of that. But Barbara, before we get there, you know, with the different work-life balances and shifts that you're dealing with, you know, and even the personal health things that seem to be on people's mind that Ami mentioned, can you talk a little bit about, you know, kind of what you're doing to help your employees balance all of those different things, their health concerns, their, you know, maybe their job anxieties, the schedules and all of that?
You know, we're doing a couple of different things. Because we're a health system. We have the benefit of having, you know, a complete psychiatry department and behavioral health leaders. And so we've set up a confidential hotline so employees can, you know, call and seek advice on a one-on-one basis, right, with psychiatrists or social workers. And then you'd be surprised, you know, especially, and maybe not as surprised with people who are treating COVID, that is a very stressful environment. And even for those folks who are not treating COVID, who have to come into a hospital environment, if you can imagine just the stress alone of coming in, whether you're on the clinical or non-clinical side of the house. So that's one thing. The other thing that we've done is we also working with our EAP provider, but in addition to just the basic services that they typically would provide, we've also set up webinars. So we have weekly webinars on different subjects around how to deal with stress during COVID, different, you know, tools to try to help people cope in this new environment. So we've done that. And then we also have an employee engagement committee here at the health system that in the past few months has really tried to pull together all the information that's been provided and given to frontline workers to make sure it's in one repository, as well as working with our employees if they needed free hotels, or if they needed free car rentals, then that engagement committee would help to take some of that pressure off, right? And go ahead and get them registered and make sure that they have what they need. So we're trying to go above and beyond what we normally do to take some of that stress off of our employees.
Thank you, Barbara. And I mean, what are you doing at Uber Eats to kind of help support, you know, again, some of the survey results you found?
Yeah, quite a few things. I'll talk about, you know, one specific larger thing that we have done across. Uber in general is a very high performance culture, high performance environment. We have, what we call as our annual reviews. We also have mid-year reviews. So this is the first time, I want to say, in the history of Uber that we've eased up on our mid-year reviews and made those things completely optional. We have said this is the cycle where we aren't going to do promotions. And I think some of our employees were disappointed with that. But what we're really trying to do is, this is not the time where we want to like pitch people against each other or go down that high performance environment at all. We really are trying to be a highly empathetic employer and try to take into account many different circumstances of our very, very talented employees. So I think just easing up on that has helped. We are also pushing many of our divisions to revisit their timelines and deadlines. It's culturally, we're a culture which is almost literally on, a very fast-paced, deliver ahead of schedule. And this is a time when we're really asking them, do you guys need to do that? And what is the flexibility? What is the true business impact? If some of these things get delayed. We're also, some of our divisions, such as the rides division, has seen a hit with, a lot of the countries going into lockdown. When I say rides, it means the ride sharing of taxi business. Internally, we have shifted a lot of our employees to then work on now our, highest performing or highest growth divisions, such as Uber Eats, which has, definitely seen a huge uptick. So I think it's been a lot of things. It's been, internally, how do we move about a lot of our teams to the businesses, which are now, growing faster than ever. Also, how do we reduce the expectations on performance? It won't be a forever thing, but at least for the next few months to take some of our employees' minds off of this.
Thank you, Ami. So Chris, just shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that I think in the future, whatever that future looks like, that's going to be a challenge for a lot of folks is the performance management aspect of a remote workforce. And it's one thing to have a certain segment of your employees working remotely and manage that, in a certain way. But I think the volume of employees working remotely, managers, is overwhelming in some cases about how do you put some structure around that. And I think Eric mentioned, it's going to have to sort of slant toward if you're getting stuff done, right? That's what we're looking for. But can you talk a little bit about maybe some of those challenges that people would face? And, the other thing I think I've heard from an executive the other day was, the micromanager is dead, right? You can't micromanage from a remote. If you're remote and they're remote, it's pretty tough. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you see going forward with performance management, maybe some tips that folks should be looking at to try to establish some structure in that process?
So yes, and I think, there are services and software and tools out there that will allow managers to monitor productivity, whether it's based on output or whether it's individual activity on certain programs on your desktop or what have you. I think the challenge then becomes, how do you enable the managers to continue to hit those metrics that they understand and that they can measure without sacrificing a certain level of employee trust, right? And so I think the managers are going to have to think about how they're going to effectively monitor and engage, but it can't be this idea, like you said, Mike, this idea of the micromanager. But I mean, the reality is management styles, I believe, are tremendously difficult to change really quickly. They require degrees of coaching, they do require training, et cetera, et cetera. So spotlighting some of these areas of concern, it can definitely be a great area of opportunity, a great area of the potential first step to say, maybe these are some of the ways you can encourage your team to deliver X, Y, and Z, or create different protocols, because you're not going to be there, co-located with them in an office environment for the time being. But the one challenge that I will throw out there is that one of my biggest concerns that I'm thinking through over the next 6 to 12 is I'm really worried that I just want to be caught that we don't over-rotate and fix a problem that's going to fundamentally change the way the culture is established, because cultures are incredibly strong and incredibly powerful in organizations. And I want to make sure that we're not thinking about how we're going to sacrifice what the culture has already been established to create a short-term solution that may not be a long-term part of your overall organizational objectives, vision, and mission that will fundamentally change the culture. And part of that is around this management style for productivity. So I would like to, express a little bit of caution. There are certain things we need to do now to make sure that we keep the lights on, meet the KPIs, do what we got to do, get the annual reviews. We've got to keep the business moving, and we need to require some level of flexibility. But employee trust is paramount because they need to understand, obviously, that we're all in this together and that we care. Let's be totally that we care, and that we're making sure that this is a safe place to work because we are all focusing on the same goal. Now, there are ways to do that in the short term that aren't going to sacrifice a sort of a longer term business objective about how you choose to manage and operationalize. So the one concern that we're seeing employers do is thinking very carefully about the changes they're making in the short term to make sure it aligns with what they're going to be seeing in the long term. And I'm a believer that trust and empathy, along with understanding how we need to keep the business running, some fundamental business objectives and principles, that's how we're going to get through this. Because ultimately at the end, again, like I said, I would hate to establish something that is a metric now that over-rotates on one environment that doesn't align with the culture fundamentally, and you've created more challenges down the road in years 2+ versus addressing the issues in months 6 to 24.
Yeah, and Eric, Chris brings up a great point, right? The short term versus the long term, and a difficult concept when you don't know what that long term looks like, right? You've got what here and today, and what we've seen is every week it changes, right? You never know what you're going to have next week. How do you balance that, especially in the performance management aspect, where you might want to put some things in place to handle the virtual workforce and maybe even train your managers on how to manage people virtually, not knowing, is it going to be an office environment next month, next year? How do you deal with that ambiguity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably one of the central questions we've been struggling with, second maybe only to the safety issues of our folks. And so, for me, what you have to do is think about those trade-offs, and if somebody is, say, going to get threatened by a performance management conversation, how can you really unleash some of the science behind mitigating that? And so one of the things we've done in our conversations is we said, let's not turn off our conversation. So we got rid of the performance review, we got rid of ratings a couple of years ago, so that was already done. But what we were having was coaching conversations. But because we didn't want folks to get into any sort of state of threat because they already had enough stress in their lives, we very quickly recrafted those conversations and the guidance we gave to managers about how to have those conversations, so that the conversations were actually much more focused on to the question that's in the chat box: empathy, understanding where people are, meeting them where they are. We were going to do more of a feedback or 360 type conversation in a lightweight form. We decided, that's going to put people who are already feeling this, existential threat or a near-term threat to their health, whatever that is, into a worse position, and that's going to only diminish performance. And so how can we have a more affirmative and affirming conversation with people? And so we quickly recrafted those conversations. But getting back to your point, Mike, a lot of companies, I think, shut that stuff off and said, hey, we can't do it right now. We can't handle that. People got enough going on. And we literally, because it was like the day we went virtual, we were about ready to launch the next conversation. We said, this thing may go on for a long time. And I'm frustrated by the fact that everybody keeps putting these deadlines out there that says 3 more weeks, 3 more weeks. I said, let's assume that this thing is going to last for who knows how long, and give people the guidance they need to keep managing their performance going forward, and shifting that with the idea that this might be a long-term thing, this might be an evolution where we realize we can actually do a much more hybridized workforce in the future, and just set up our training programs around this with the idea that this could be the new normal, could exist perpetually. And so figuring out those trade-offs in terms of balancing the near term and the far term is, let's imagine that this thing could last for a year or 2 or 3. What are the things that we'd be happy to have in place, even if it lasts for a long time?
Thanks, Eric. And I wanted to go to one of the questions that came in through the audience. And I think it pertains to this concept. And it also goes back a little bit to, maybe the different environments that some of your remote workforce is in. And just open up the panel, whoever has a perspective. You've got managers that may be out there that are in one situation, and maybe some that just love the idea of working virtually. Maybe some other of their employees are struggling, right? So maybe they have a home life where their hours aren't as easy, their spaces aren't as convenient. How do you create the empathy? How do you instill that empathy into a manager that may be looking and saying, I don't understand why this person's not performing, or they're not performing, and they're not really seeing the full picture of not only the situation that they've been put in, in the home life, but maybe even some concerns they have around health and those kinds of things. Just want to open up that panel if anybody's got some ideas around how you have those conversations with managers, and what are some key points you might talk about?
Mike, I can go first and give you just a little bit of perspective. Now more than ever before, we really are pushing our managers to shift their performance measures from activity-based to very outcome-based. So where I'm going with this is, I think, traditionally for a lot of our teams, they've also measured performance through, like team huddles and who shows up where, how much, and if it's a sales team, we also had been tracking a lot of, other things, which are very activity based. Now we are really, really pushing the envelope on how many restaurants did you close, or how many, so I think that shift, and again, it's not easy for a lot of functions. So it is not obvious, it's not intuitive, it's also not the way people have managed things before. So for many teams, we are getting the pushback on how do I even do that? That makes no sense. So just a different mindset is what is required right now. And once you shift it to outcome based, there is a good possibility that they see some lower performing employees as really higher performing than ever before. So I think that's helping. Just more tactically, we've also rolled out a course called as Managing Through Ambiguity, because what we see is literally everything that a manager may be used to before in how they managed a team, in how they measured productivity, in what was good is now out the window, and they just have to look at things very differently and probably redesign a lot of things for what we don't know is a short-term or a long-term process. So yeah, those are a couple of things we're doing.
Thank you. Any other perspectives?
I can jump in here just quickly. I think one of the key sort of things we need to do is there is just necessarily going to have to be an unlevel playing field due to people's immediate circumstances, and that stuff is going to wane over time. Daycares are going to open up. Not everybody's going to be living this environment, and so we've taken the perspective of there are people who are just going to have to step up right now to help each other, just like the folks in Barbara's company, or rather agency, are going to be stepping up on the front lines in a way that we don't have to, or the grocery workers have. And there's some of us who are working a lot more than we used to and a lot harder, and we're doing that to help those who have much messier personal circumstances right now, and that's just going to have to be okay. And if you can give me 50% of your capacity, then you're going to have to focus on the work that really, really matters, rather than some of that transactional work that you may have had the luxury of doing before. And if that's all you can provide for me right now, I have to just be okay with that. And so what we're doing is trying to coach our managers of, give them the sense of like, when they do work, it's got to be really meaningful work that matters. Don't focus on whether you got a full day's work or not, if they are in a situation that you understand is a lot more challenging, and having that perspective on them. And so we literally have all of our managers having conversations just so they can understand, what challenges people are facing at home, so then they can reset the expectations. At some point that may have to toggle a little bit more so that people are a little more balanced, because we can't necessarily have people working at 130% of what they used to forever in service of others, but I think that's imperative right now. We're not on the same playing field.
Thanks, Chris, Barbara, any thoughts around that?
No thoughts from me on this end. I don't think we really, our business model is a little more unique. I think what we've tried to do from an empathy perspective is just to put more benefits out there for our employees, right? So in a healthcare environment, whether employees are getting infected in the workplace or infected in their various communities, we've tried to be very empathetic there to allow them more benefit time, to put testing on our campuses so our employees can be tested immediately on site. So When it comes to the telework piece, because it's such a small piece of our total business model, it's just, you know, we've got a lot of work there to do yet. And so I'm learning a lot just from hearing from my colleagues here on today's call.
Thank you, Barbara. Chris?
Just real quick, I would underscore and echo the thought of moving from activity to action. So this idea of outcomes based, because you're not going to be able to measure on specific data, you know, elements that go into it. You just need to understand the product that comes out of it, and how that moves the business. So I think we spend a lot of time, a lot of our days, and a lot of activity that doesn't really drive the needle. To Eric's point, we've got to be focused, hyper focused on action that's going to actually have a meaningful impact on getting through this and growing the firm.
Thanks, Chris. So we're getting close to time, but Chris, I wanted to kind of finish one question to you. You know, you've got this future workforce, whatever it looks like. You know, who knows? You know, there's going to be organizations that open up sooner than later, organizations that have people come back sooner than later. What kind of advice? I know it's kind of a general question, but what kind of advice would you have for you know, HR executives that are dealing with folks that may want to come back earlier than they want them to, may want to come back later than they want to do for health reasons? You're going to have a whole gamut of that. What's your advice for executives that have to deal with that kind of environment? You know, I mean, I think everybody would say safety first, but there is a productivity issue. There's a keeping the business alive issue. Any words of wisdom before we break away?
So real quick, I would just keep it down to three things: show you care, ensure the work site is safe, and show that we're all in this together. And regardless of where you are, virtual or in the office, and to be flexible, those three things from a leadership standpoint, I think are going to really continue as we flex. This is not a static environment. We need to be completely fluid, but at the same time, need to recognize that there are certain things that we have to do to continue to move forward. But putting these rules and these restrictions that's going to peanut butter across an entire workforce of 500 or 500,000 employees, I think right now is a bit myopic. And I think we need everyone's been talking and doing a great example of how you flex and you pull, and you either add in more additional healthcare benefits, or you look at new ways of doing your performance review management, or you look at new ways of creating that asynchronetic conversation. I think that's where those three areas, showing that you care, making sure it's safe, and showing that we're all in together.
Thanks so much, Chris. We are out of time. Thank you all for joining us today. And for next week, we actually have two webinars. One, and we touched on both of them a little bit in this webinar, on June 3rd, talking about childcare and the current situation. And then on June 5th, discussing a little bit more detail around performance management and kind of the new world. So thank you again, everyone, for joining me on the panel, and thank you for attending, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.